The rain lashed against the tinted windows of the black SUV like 1,000 tiny needles, but inside the silence was far more piercing. Elena Rossi sat huddled in the corner of the leather seat, her breath hitching every time the tires hit a pothole. Her father, Silvio, sat beside her, his face a ghostly mask of sweat and desperation. He wouldn't look at her. He couldn't. He had spent his life gambling with things he didn't own, and tonight, the stakes had finally reached his own blood. The vehicle slowed as it approached the towering iron gates of the Moretti estate, a sprawling fortress of stone and shadow that loomed over the city like a predatory bird. This was the lair of the Iron King Dante Moretti, a man whose name was whispered in confessionals and back alleys with the same level of dread. The gates groaned open, a metallic roar that sounded to Elena like the jaws of a trap snapping shut. When the door was yanked open, the frigid night air slapped Elena's face, smelling of pine and expensive gasoline. A man with a neck as thick as an oak tree grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "Out! Now!" he barked. Elena stumbled, her legs heavy and uncooperative. She had always been a girl of soft curves and gentle disposition, a plump little lamb, as the neighborhood bullies used to call her, but tonight she felt like a leaden weight being dragged toward an altar. They were led into a foyer that defied imagination. Soaring ceilings, gold-leafed moldings, and a floor of black marble so polished it looked like a dark pool of water. Standing in the center of the room was Dante Moretti. He was taller than the stories suggested, draped in a charcoal suit that cost more than Elena's childhood home. His eyes were the color of a winter sea, cold and utterly devoid of mercy. Silvio threw himself at Dante's feet, his sobs echoing off the high walls. "Dante, please. I just need more time. The shipments will come in, the docks are." Dante didn't even look down at the man groveling on the floor. His gaze was fixed on Elena, scanning her from her trembling chin down to her scuffed shoes. He didn't see a person. He saw a line item on a ledger. "Is this the collateral, Silvio?" Dante's voice was a low melodic rumble that sent a shiver of pure ice down Elena's spine. "A girl? You owe me 12 million euros, and you bring me a girl who looks like she spent more time in a bakery than a boardroom." A chorus of cruel laughter erupted from the balcony above. Elena looked up to see a group of women in shimmering evening gowns, Dante's distractions, clinging to the railing and pointing at her. "She's a bit substantial, isn't she, Dante?" One of them sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "What are you going to do with her? Use her as a doorstop." Elena's face burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the mansion's warmth. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the floor would simply open up and swallow her whole. She felt the weight of her body, the softness of her waist that she had always tried to hide under oversized sweaters, now laid bare as a mark of her perceived worthlessness. Dante stepped forward, the click of his handmade Italian shoes sounding like a death knell. He reached out, his gloved hand tilting her chin up. Elena forced herself to look at him, her eyes brimming with tears she refused to let fall. "She's soft," Dante remarked, his thumb brushing against her jawline with a terrifying clinical detachment. "Softness is a luxury we don't afford in this house. But she is Rossi blood, and the Rossis always pay their debts." He turned his back on them, his coat swirling like a shadow. "Take the father to the cellar until the paperwork is signed. Take the girl to the kitchens. If she wants to eat, she works. The debt is 12 million. At minimum wage, she should be finished in about 300 years. The guards dragged Silvio away, his screams for mercy fading into the depths of the mansion. Elena was shoved toward a narrow service door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. For the next 3 hours she was plunged into a world of steam, grease, and verbal abuse. The head chef, a man with a scarred face and a temper like a pressurized boiler, didn't care who her father was. He saw a body that could scrub and he put it to use. "Down on your knees, girl," he roared, kicking a bucket of caustic lye toward her. "The grand hall needs to be spotless before the council arrives tomorrow. If I see a single smudge on that marble, you don't get a bed." Elena didn't argue. She couldn't. She took the heavy brush and sank to the floor, her knees aching as they hit the cold stone. The mansion grew quiet as the night deepened, the only sound the rhythmic scritch-scratch of her brush, and the distant chime of a grandfather clock. Her hands were raw, the skin stinging from the chemicals, but she kept moving. She had to. It was the only way to keep the crushing weight of her reality at bay. As she reached the center of the hall, near the great mahogany doors of Dante's private study, her hand slipped. Her fingers, slick with soapy water, brushed against the pocket of her apron. Something heavy and metallic slid out. It hit the marble with a soft clink and rolled across the floor, shimmering under the dim amber lights of the chandeliers. Elena's heart stopped. It was her mother's ring. It was a strange tarnished thing. A thick band of what looked like dull silver, topped with a heavy blackened stone that seemed to swallow the light. Her mother had given it to her on her deathbed, whispering words Elena hadn't understood at the time. Asterisk, never show them, Elena. Not until the world is at its darkest. It is your shield. It is your throne. Asterisk, to Elena it had always just been a piece of junk. A worthless heirloom that even the hawk shops wouldn't take. But it was all she had left of the woman who had loved her without conditions. Panicked, Elena scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't let them take it. If the guards saw it, they'd steal it. If Dante saw it, he'd probably laugh at how pathetic her only treasure was. She reached for the ring, her fingers just inches away from the dull metal, when the massive mahogany doors groaned open. A shadow fell over her, long and imposing. Elena froze. Her hand stayed outstretched, hovering over the ring. Slowly she looked up. Dante Moretti stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked tired, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He looked down at the girl on her knees, covered in gray suds and grime, and then his gaze shifted to the object on the floor. Elena's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her chest. She made a desperate, clumsy lunge for the ring, her fingers closing around the cold metal just as Dante's boots stepped into her field of vision. He didn't move. He simply stared at her clenched fist, his brow furrowing in a way that made the air in the room feel suddenly dangerously thin. "What are you hiding, little lamb?" he asked, his voice a low, predatory hiss. "In this house, everything you own belongs to me. Open your hand." Elena's fingers trembled so violently that the ring clattered against the stone once more before she finally clamped her fist over it. She could feel the sharp edges of the tarnished metal digging into her palm, a small biting pain that grounded her as Dante's shadow loomed closer. He didn't just stand there. He radiated a cold, suffocating pressure that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the hallway. He reached down, his large scarred hand wrapping around her wrist with the precision of a hawk's talon. He didn't pull her up. He simply held her there, forced into a submissive kneel, while his thumb traced the line of her pulse. "I asked you a question, Elena," he murmured, his voice like velvet over broken glass. "What is so precious that you would crawl through filth to hide it from me?" Elena swallowed hard, her throat dry. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears but her jaw set in a stubborn line. "It's a ghost, Mr. Moretti," she whispered. "The only thing my mother left me. It's worth nothing to a man who owns the city." Dante stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. He saw the smudge of dirt on her cheek, the way her cheap uniform strained against her curves, and the fierce, flickering light in her eyes that didn't match the broken girl her father had sold. With a grunt of dismissal, he released her. "Keep your trinket. But remember, in this house, even your ghosts belong to the Moretti family. Get back to work. The floor isn't going to scrub itself." The following week was a descent into a living purgatory. Elena was moved from the kitchens to the general housekeeping staff, a promotion that felt more like a sentence. Sophia, the head housekeeper, a woman whose heart was as withered as her face, took a particular interest in making Elena's life miserable. "Move faster, you heavy-footed cow," Sophia would hiss, slapping a wet rag against Elena's shoulder. "The masters don't like to hear the floorboards groaning under your weight." The other maids were no better. They whispered behind their hands, mocking the plump little debt girl, who dared to breathe the same air as the Iron King. They stole her rations, replaced her soap with caustic soda, and tripped her in the dark corridors. But Elena didn't break. She learned to move in silence, to use her size to shield herself, and most importantly, she learned to listen. Behind the closed doors of the Moretti mansion, she heard the secrets of the underworld, the shipments of sugar that were actually heroin, the names of judges who were on the payroll, and the rising tension between Dante and the rival families of the North. She kept her mother's ring tucked into a hidden pocket she'd sewn into her bodice, the cold metal a constant reminder that she was more than the names they called her. Dante, however, was a constant, unsettling presence. He would appear in doorways when she least expected it, watching her work with an unreadable expression. He noticed how she didn't cry when the other girls bullied her. He noticed how she organized the library with a scholar's precision, and how she seemed to know exactly which wine he preferred before he even asked. There was a spark of intelligence in her that bothered him, a dignity that shouldn't exist in someone so discarded. The night of the grand gala arrived like a storm. The mansion was transformed into a glittering fortress of gold and blood-red silk. The most powerful, and most dangerous, men in the country were descending upon the estate to discuss a new treaty. Elena was forced into a restrictive, black velvet servant's dress that felt like an iron cage. "You will serve the drinks in the West Wing," Sophia ordered, cinching Elena's corset so tight it left her gasping. "And for God's sake, try to stay in the shadows. We don't want the guests losing their appetites looking at you." Elena took the silver tray, her knuckles white as she gripped the handles. She walked into the ballroom, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, heavy perfumes, and the underlying metallic tang of hidden weapons. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, weaving between the tuxedoed monsters and their diamond-clad mistresses. She saw Dante at the center of the room, looking like a dark god in a bespoke midnight blue suit. He was surrounded by vipers, but he was the king of them all. Elena was refilling a glass of champagne when a heavy, moist hand slammed down on her shoulder. She stumbled, the tray rattling. Well, what have we here?" a slurred, booming voice announced. It was Baron Vico, a rival boss known for his cruelty and his lack of restraint. He was a bloated man with piggish eyes that wandered over Elena with disgusting intent. "Dante, your hospitality is slipping. Why are you serving us appetizers that have already been overfed?" A ripple of cruel laughter broke out among the nearby guests. Elena felt the heat of humiliation crawling up her neck, but she didn't look down. She tried to pull away, but Vico's grip tightened, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Don't be shy, little piglet. I like a girl with some meat on her bones. Makes the slaughter more satisfying." He reached out to grab her chin, his other hand sliding down to her waist. The room went quiet, the kind of silence that precedes a gunshot. Dante stood a few feet away, his glass halfway to his lips, his eyes narrowing into deadly slits. Elena felt a surge of white-hot rage break through her fear. As Vico's hand clamped onto her wrist, trying to pull her closer to his whiskey-soaked breath, she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She twisted her arm with a sudden violent strength, her hand catching the light as she shoved his chest. In the struggle, Vico's rough, diamond-encrusted ring scraped harshly against the tarnished silver of Elena's heirloom. The sound was like a crystalline snap. The thick black oxidation that had covered the ring for 20 years didn't just flake off. It shattered. Underneath the grime, a deep, pulsating crimson light began to bleed through. As Elena wrenched her hand back, the friction of the assault had stripped the worthless silver to reveal a band of pure white platinum, engraved with a lion whose eyes were weeping rubies. The gemstone at the center, once a dull black rock, now glowed with an inner fire, casting a rhythmic blood-red light across Elena's terrified face. Vico froze, his mouth hanging open. The laughter in the room died instantly, replaced by a vacuum of sound so absolute it felt like the walls were closing in. Elena stared at her own hand, watching as the ring seemed to wake up, the ruby glowing brighter with every beat of her accelerating heart. In the corner of the room, a glass shattered against the marble. Don Valerius, the oldest and most feared elder of the High Council, A man who hadn't stood up for a dawn in a decade was trembling. His face had gone ashen, his eyes fixed on the glowing lion on Elena's finger. He pushed past the guards, his cane clattering to the floor as he stumbled toward the center of the room. Every head turned. Dante took a step forward, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his small of his back, his gaze darting between the glowing ring and the girl he had treated as a slave. Valerius reached Elena, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't look at Vico. He didn't look at Dante. He looked at the plump girl, with a mixture of religious awe and soul-crushing terror. To the shock of every person in the room, the old man slowly, painfully, sank to his bruised knees, bowing his head until it nearly touched Elena's shoes. "The eye of the Empress," he whispered, his voice echoing in the deathly silent hall. "The sovereign has returned." The silence in the grand hall was no longer the silence of tension. It was the vacuum of a tomb suddenly opened to reveal a living god. Elena stood paralyzed, her hand still trembling in the air. The ruby light of the ring pulsing like a rhythmic bleeding heart. The crimson glow cast long, jagged shadows against the frescoes of the ceiling, turning the opulent ballroom into a cathedral of blood and shadow. Don Valerius, the man whose name was whispered with more fear than the devil's own, remained pressed against the cold marble, his forehead touching the tips of Elena's scuffed shoes. The sound of his labored breathing was the only thing breaking the stillness. "Forgive us," Valerius rasped, his voice cracking with an age-old terror. "Forgive the blindness of the sons who forgot the mother of the flame." Vico, the rival boss who had just moments ago been sneering at Elena's weight and status, took a staggering step back. His face was a mask of sickly gray. "That's impossible," he hissed, though his voice lacked any conviction. "The Shadow Empress died in the Purge 20 years ago. Her line was extinguished. That ring. It must be a fake. A clever piece of glass." Valerius didn't even look up, but his voice turned into a whip of cold steel. "Silence, you fool. Look at the stone. Do you not see the weeping eye? It reacts only to the blood of the Rossi matriarchs. It doesn't just glow, it recognizes. If she were an imposter, the mechanism would have injected a neurotoxin into her marrow the moment she put it on. She stands before you because the heritage accepts her." Elena looked down at the ring. She felt a strange, creeping warmth spreading from her finger, up her arm and settling in her chest. It wasn't just heat. It was a sense of ancient heavy weight, as if the ghosts of 1,000 powerful women were suddenly standing behind her, bracing her trembling spine. She looked at Dante Moretti. The Iron King was frozen. His jaw was set so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. His ego, his carefully constructed empire of fear, was crumbling in the face of an old law he had thought was merely a myth used to frighten initiates. For the Moretti family, loyalty to the Shadow Empress was the foundational oath, an unbreakable blood pact that predated the modern mafia. To defy the ring was to invite a death sentence from every family in the commission. One by one the sound began. Asterisk thud. 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 Asterisk it was the sound of knees hitting the floor. First the elders who stood behind Valerius. Then the elite guards, men who had killed hundreds without blinking, lowered their heads and tucked their weapons away, sinking into a submissive posture. The mistresses who had mocked Elena's plump figure only minutes ago were now trembling, some of them weeping in sheer panic, realizing they had spent weeks bullying a woman who could now order their execution with a flick of her wrist. The wave of submission moved through the hall like a falling row of dominoes until only one man remained standing. Dante Moretti. His eyes burned into Elena's. There was a war raging behind those dark irises. Fury, disbelief, and a burgeoning, terrifying realization. He looked at the girl he had ordered to scrub his floors, the girl he had treated as a disposable asset to satisfy a debt. He looked at her soft features, her wide, tear-streaked eyes, and the curves of her body that he had once viewed with indifference. Now those same features seemed to hold a regal gravity. She wasn't just Elena Rossi anymore. She was the sovereign. "Dante," Valerius warned from the floor, his voice low and urgent. "The law is absolute. Do not bring ruin upon your house for the sake of your pride. Dante's hand, resting on the hilt of the dagger at his belt, twitched. For a second, Elena thought he might actually kill her, that he would rather burn the world down than bow to his servant. He took a slow, predatory step toward her. The guard shifted, but no one dared intervene. He stopped inches from her, his towering frame casting a shadow that completely enveloped her. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't know where the courage came from, but she looked him straight in the eye, the red light of the ring reflecting in her pupils. The debt is paid, Dante, she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. A muscle jumped in Dante's cheek. Then, with a slow, agonizing deliberation that felt more intimate than a touch, he began to descend. He dropped to one knee, his head remaining high for a moment longer before he finally bowed it. My life, my house, and my blade are yours, my lady, he murmured, the words sounding as if they were being torn from his throat. The Iron King had broken. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from a party to a military operation. Valerius stood up, though he kept his eyes cast downward. She is not safe here, the elder commanded, his voice booming. The moment word leaves this room, every scavenger from here to Sicily will be coming for that ring. It is the key to the Shadow Throne, the vault of the 5 families. Dante, move her to the master suite. Triple the perimeter. If so much as a fly touches her without her consent, I will personally see the Moretti name erased from the ledger. Dante stood, his expression unreadable, a cold mask of professional efficiency masking the turmoil beneath. He turned to Elena, and for the first time he didn't look at her with contempt. He looked at her as one might look at a beautiful unexploded bomb. Follow me, he said, his voice a low growl. He didn't wait for her answer, but as he walked, he cleared a path through the kneeling crowd with a ferocity that suggested he would kill anyone who even looked at her. Elena followed him, her head spinning. Only an hour ago, she had been a plump little lamb sent to the slaughter. Now she was being escorted through the mansion like a queen. As they reached the upper floors, far away from the prying eyes of the council, Dante stopped at the massive oak doors of his personal suite, the most secure room in the estate. He pushed the doors open but didn't enter. He turned to face her, his eyes tracing the line of the ring on her finger. You knew, he accused softly, his voice vibrating with a dangerous edge. You knew what you were when your father brought you here. I didn't, Elena protested, her voice small. My mother told me it was a family heirloom, a lucky charm. She told me to keep it hidden, to never show it to anyone. She told me my weight would keep me safe, that men wouldn't look twice at a girl like me, and that was a blessing. Dante stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in the narrow hallway. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering near her cheek before he pulled it back, as if burned. Your mother was a genius, he muttered. She hid a diamond in a mountain of coal. But the coal is gone now, Elena. There is no hiding anymore. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. The ring makes you the sovereign, but in this house you are my responsibility. And the Shadow Throne has a price. People have died for centuries just to catch a glimpse of that ruby. He stepped back, his eyes darkening. Rest while you can. Tomorrow the world finds out the Empress has an heir, and they will come to tear that ring, and the finger it's on, off your hand. He began to close the door but paused. And Elena? Don't think for a second that because I knelt I am tamed. I bowed to the ring. I haven't yet decided what to do with the girl wearing it. The heavy doors clicked shut, locking with a series of electronic bolts. Elena stood alone in the center of the most luxurious room she had ever seen, the silence of the suite pressing against her ears. She looked at the ring. The red glow had dimmed to a soft, constant pulse, as if it were sleeping. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling city she now technically owned. But as she watched the distant lights, she saw something that made her blood run cold. On the lawn below, past the first line of Moretti guards, a series of small green laser dots were dancing across the glass of her window. The hunt hadn't waited for morning. It had already begun. The glass didn't just break. It disintegrated into a million diamond-like shards that sprayed across the plush Persian rug. Elena didn't even have time to scream before a heavy warm weight slammed into her, tackling her to the floor. The scent of expensive cologne and gunpowder filled her senses. Dante. He had kicked the door open the exact second the first bullet whistled through the air, his instincts honed by a lifetime of assassination attempts. "Stay down," he roared, his body shielding hers as more muffled thuds echoed against the reinforced walls. The laser dots vanished, replaced by the frantic shouting of guards in the hallway and the rapid-fire return of submachine guns from the balcony below. Dante dragged her toward the walk-in closet, which she now realized was a steel-lined panic room. He shoved her inside and slammed the heavy door, the silence of the vacuum seal cutting off the chaos outside. Elena sat on the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands trembling as she clutched the ring. The ruby was pulsing again, a rhythmic deep crimson light that seemed to beat in time with her frantic heart. She looked up to see Dante leaning against the door, his chest heaving, a thin trail of blood running down his temple where a glass shard had grazed him. He looked at her, and for the first time, the cold indifference in his eyes was gone, replaced by a terrifying intensity. "They know," he hissed. The word traveled faster than a bullet. "The council elders are divided. But the scavengers? They aren't waiting for a formal decree. They want the sovereign's blood." Before Elena could respond, a hidden panel in the back of the panic room slid open with a hiss of hydraulics. Don Valerius stepped out, his face pale, his regal posture slightly slumped with the weight of the night's revelations. He ignored Dante and walked straight to Elena, falling to his knees once more, though this time it was with the practiced ease of a man who had waited 20 years for this moment. "Forgive the intrusion, my lady," he whispered, his voice cracking. "But the wolves are at the door, and you do not yet know the teeth you possess." He reached out, gesturing toward the ring. "This is not merely jewelry, Elena. It is the keystone of the abyss. Your mother, Isabella, the Shadow Empress, didn't just vanish. She realized that the 5 families had grown too greedy, too violent. She took the keys to the kingdom and went into the shadows to protect the only thing that mattered. You." Elena looked at her hands, the hands she had always hated for being too soft, too round. "My mother. She told me I was nobody. She told me to stay quiet, to eat, to be unremarkable. She said the world was cruel to beautiful women." Valerius let out a bittersweet laugh. "She was hiding you in plain sight, child. In our world, power is skinny, sharp, and draped in silk. By encouraging you to embrace a different shape, she ensured that no scout, no assassin, and no rival Don would ever look at you and see the bloodline of the Empress. You were invisible because they chose not to see you. Your weight was your armor, and your perceived unworthiness was your greatest fortress. They were looking for a tiger, so they ignored the lamb. But the lamb has the heart of a lion." Dante paced the small room, his hand white-knuckled on the grip of his pistol. "Explain the vault, Valerius. If they breach the perimeter, she needs to know why they're willing to burn this city to the ground for a piece of silver." The old man nodded, his eyes fixed on the glowing ruby. "The ring is a biometric and mechanical key. It unlocks the Vault of Silence, a subterranean fortress built beneath the city's foundations. It contains the ledgers of every sin committed by the 5 families for a century, the blackmail, the bank accounts, the locations of every weapon cache and drug route in the hemisphere. But more than that, it holds the legacy fund, a wealth so vast it could crash the global market. Whoever wears that ring doesn't just lead the mafia. They own the destiny of the underworld." Elena felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "I don't want it," she whispered. "I just wanted to pay my father's debt and go home." Dante stopped pacing and knelt in front of her, forcing her to look at him. His hand moved to her chin, his touch surprisingly gentle. "There is no going home, Elena. Your father didn't just gamble money. He gambled your life, knowing exactly who you were. He hoped that by selling you to me, the ring would eventually fall into his hands through some twisted inheritance. He's not a victim of debt, he's a traitor to your mother's blood. The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. Her father's gambling, his tears, his desperation, it had all been a play. A long con to deliver her into the hands of the Moretti family, so he could slink back into the shadows with the spoils. Her sadness curdled into something hot and sharp. For the first time in her life, Elena didn't feel like a plump little lamb. She felt the ancient, sleeping power of her lineage stirring in her veins. She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. "If they want the ring," she said, her voice steadying, "they'll have to take it from the Empress." Dante's lips pulled back into a grim predatory smile. "That's more like it." He turned to Valerius. "We can't stay here. My brother Marco has already turned half the outer guard. He's always been jealous of my seat, and now he thinks he can take the shadow throne for himself. He's bringing in the heavy hitters." "The tunnels," Valerius urged, pointing to the secret passage. "They lead to the foundation of the old estate. It's the only path they won't expect. Marco thinks you'll try to break out through the front gates with an armored convoy." Dante checked his ammunition and handed a smaller, sleek silver pistol to Elena. She stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. "I don't know how to use this," she stammered. Dante stepped behind her, his large hands covering hers as he guided her grip. "Point, breathe, and squeeze. But don't worry, Sovereign. I'm not letting anyone get close enough for you to need it." Just as they stepped into the dark, narrow passage behind the wall, a deafening roar shook the entire mansion. The floor buckled, and the sound of masonry groaning under the weight of an explosion echoed through the vents. The panic room door, the one rated to withstand a tank shell, was warped inward by a massive thermite charge. Black smoke began to pour through the gaps. "Marco," Dante spat, his eyes flashing with murderous intent. "He's not trying to capture you anymore. He's trying to level the building and sift through the ashes for the ring." "Move," Valerius hissed, ushering them into the darkness. As they descended the steep stone stairs, the sounds of war intensified above them. Screams, the staccato rhythm of rifles, and the crashing of crystal chandeliers filled the air. Elena looked back one last time at the luxury she had briefly inhabited, now being consumed by fire. She realized then that the girl who had walked into this mansion as a debt payment was dead. They reached a heavy iron door at the base of the stairs, marked with the same lion with the weeping eye symbol as her ring. As Dante reached for the handle, the stone walls around them vibrated. A voice boomed through the mansion's internal intercom system, distorted and filled with a manic high-pitched glee. "Dante, little brother, you always did have a weakness for strays. Leave the fat girl and the old man, and maybe I'll let you live long enough to watch me wear the crown." Dante didn't flinch. He looked at Elena, his gaze lingering on the ring that was now glowing a fierce, angry violet. "He has no idea what he just woke up," Dante whispered. He threw the door open, revealing a labyrinth of dripping stone and ancient machinery. But as they stepped inside, the lights flickered and died. In the sudden pitch black, the only thing visible was the ring on Elena's finger, shining like a beacon. And from the darkness ahead, the sound of a dozen safeties being clicked off echoed through the chamber. They weren't alone in the tunnels. The coup had already cut off their only exit. The darkness didn't just hide the enemies. It felt like a living thing, breathing against their skin with the scent of wet limestone and ancient, stagnant air. Dante's hand found Elena's in the pitch black, his grip crushing and possessive. He pulled her flush against his side, his body a shield of solid muscle and Kevlar. "Don't move," he hissed, the heat of his breath ghosting over her ear. "If you see a flash, drop to your knees." The violet glow from the ring on Elena's finger pulsed like a dying star, casting long, distorted shadows of the men hiding in the alcoves ahead. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of automatic fire. Bullets chewed into the stone walls, sending a spray of grit and sparks into the air. Dante didn't just fire back. He moved with the predatory grace of a man born for the kill. He leaned around a pillar, his desert eagle roaring twice, the muzzle flashes illuminating his face, set in a mask of cold, murderous fury. Two heavy thuds followed as the hidden gunman collapsed into the shallow water lining the floor. "They're coming from both sides," Valerius shouted, his voice cracking with age but his hand steady as he aimed a compact pistol toward the stairs they had just descended. "The tunnels are a bottleneck, Dante. We're being funneled." Elena felt the adrenaline surging, a wild electric current that seemed to originate from the ring. She wasn't the trembling girl who had been dragged into the mansion anymore. She looked at the walls, her eyes tracking the violet light as it danced across the carvings. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, reciting the old stories she once thought were mere fairy tales. "The lion weeps when the path is lost, but his tears are the key to the kingdom." "Dante, stop!" she cried out as he prepared to rush the next corner. "The floor! Look at the floor!" Dante froze, his boot hovering inches above a slab of stone etched with a faint, weeping eye. He looked back at her, his eyes narrowed. "It's a pressure plate," Elena whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pointed the ring toward a specific section of the wall where the carvings of lions were most dense. "My mother. She told me about this. The lion's labyrinth wasn't meant to keep people out. It was meant to kill anyone who didn't carry the sovereign's blood. If you step there, the ceiling collapses." Dante looked from the floor to Elena, a flicker of something new in his gaze. Not just protectiveness but a burgeoning, profound respect. He stepped back, allowing her to lead. "Show us the way, Elena," he said, his voice dropping an octave, thick with an emotion she couldn't yet name. As they navigated deeper into the bowels of the earth, the mechanical complexity of the tunnels grew. They encountered a massive iron gate. Its gears rusted into a frozen snarl. Behind them, the sound of Marco's men grew louder, shouts of command, the heavy thud of tactical boots, and the terrifying whir of a portable saw cutting through the iron door at the entrance. "We're trapped?" Valerius gasped, leaning against the cold wall, his breath coming in ragged hitches. "There's no mechanism, no lever." The Shadow Empress took the secret of the gate to her grave. Elena approached the gate. She felt the weight of her own body, the plumpness that had always been a source of shame, but now it felt like a grounded strength. She realized her mother hadn't just hidden her identity. She had fed her the keys to this empire in the form of bedtime stories while they shared simple meals. She looked at the center of the gate, where a small indentation in the shape of a lion's maw waited. "It doesn't want a lever," Elena said, her voice steadying. "It wants a price." She turned to Dante, seeing the blood on his temple from a grazing bullet, the way he stood ready to die for a woman he had bought as a debt. The irony wasn't lost on her. He had seen her as a commodity, but here in the dark, she was his only hope. "Dante, give me your knife," she commanded. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before unsheathing a blackened combat blade and handing it to her hilt first. Elena didn't flinch. She pressed the sharp edge against her palm and drew it across, a sharp sting followed by the warmth of blood. She pressed her bleeding hand into the lion's maw, the ring clicking into a hidden groove within the stone. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the hum began, a low-frequency vibration that shook the very marrow of their bones. The violet light of the ring flared into a brilliant, blinding crimson. The gears began to groan, ancient mechanisms grinding against decades of rust. The massive iron gate didn't just open. It retracted into the ceiling with a thunderous boom. "Go! Move!" Dante yelled, shoving Valerius through the opening. He turned to grab Elena, but he stopped, his hand hovering near her waist. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing the blood on her hand and the fire in her eyes. The woman standing before him was no longer a victim. She was a queen in the making, draped in shadows and blood. "You're incredible," he whispered, the words forced out of him by sheer awe. But the moment was shattered as a grenade bounced across the stone floor behind them. Dante tackled Elena through the gateway just as the explosion rocked the tunnel, the shockwave throwing them into a secondary chamber. As the dust settled, Elena looked up to find they were in a dead end. The path behind them was blocked by the debris of the explosion, and the room they were in was a circular chamber with no visible exits. The walls were lined with mirrors, hundreds of them, reflecting their battered, dusty images back at them. A dead end. Valerius groaned, sliding to the floor in despair. Marco will be through that rubble in minutes. Dante stood up, checking his last magazine. He looked at the mirrors, then at Elena. He saw her reflection multiplied 1,000 times. 1,000 versions of a woman who had just saved his life. He walked over to her, taking her injured hand and tearing a strip of his own shirt to bind the wound. "We aren't dead yet," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "Look at the ring, Elena. It's not just glowing anymore. It's pointing." Elena looked down. The ring was vibrating so violently it was numbing her finger, and a single beam of concentrated red light was shooting out from the gemstone, hitting one specific mirror in the center of the room. She walked toward it, her reflection walking toward her. But as she got closer, she realized the woman in the mirror didn't look like her. The reflection was taller, thinner, dressed in regal black silk. It was the image of her mother, the Shadow Empress. The reflection raised a hand, pointing toward the floor beneath Elena's feet. "Dante, get back!" Elena screamed as the floor beneath the central mirror began to rotate. A circular section of the stone dropped away, revealing a vertical shaft that plummeted into a darkness so deep it seemed to swallow the light of the ring. From the other side of the rubble, the sound of drilling intensified. Marco's men were breaking through. Elena looked at the dark abyss, then at Dante. "We have to jump," she said, the madness of the suggestion echoing in the small room. Dante looked at the hole, then at the wall of debris that was starting to buckle under the pressure of a secondary charge. He stepped toward Elena, wrapping a powerful arm around her waist and pulling her into his chest. "If we die," he muttered, his voice thick with a sudden raw honesty, "I'm glad it's with you." He didn't wait for her to answer. He stepped into the void, pulling her with him into the whistling dark. As they fell, a final explosion tore through the chamber above, and the last thing Elena saw was the face of Marco Moretti peering through the smoke, his expression of triumph turning into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror as he realized his prize was slipping through his fingers. They were falling, the wind screaming past them, until a sudden jarring impact hit them, not of stone but of ice-cold rushing water. Elena gasped as she surfaced, the current catching her, dragging her deeper into the hidden veins of the city. She reached out, her fingers catching a slick rock, and as she pulled herself up, she saw it. A massive subterranean vault door, and standing before it was a figure she thought was long dead.